So today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Giles Hutchins from UK. And Giles and I have met in Copenhagen. And I remember we had a fantastic time with talking about the next stage of leadership and organization there. And I'm really happy to meet you again like this, Giles. Hi.
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah, and then Giles is an author and a speaker, public speaker, and pioneering practitioner on leadership consciousness. And then he recently co-authored his third book on regenerative leadership, this book. Giles has over 20 years business experience in helping all shapes and sizes of organization transform as management consultant. And then he's now currently chairman of the Future Fit Leadership Academy, leading partner of the Natural Business Partnership, and co-founder of Biomimicry for Creative Innovation, and also co-founder of Regenerative. So welcome, Giles, and it's a great pleasure to talk with you. So firstly, would you tell us a little bit about who you are and then what you do?
Yeah, well, I have a deep connection with nature. I've always felt deeply in love with nature from as early as I can recall. And then later on in my teenage years, came to realize that there were some major problems with civilization, and that those major problems in civilization actually were related to our sense of disconnection with nature. So I then, from an early age, vowed to go into business, to understand business at a deep level, so I could help business become a force for good in the world. And so for the last 25 years, I have been a management consultant, head of practice with KPMG, helping all sorts of organizations around the world transform. And I've also been global head of sustainability for a multinational IT services company, Atos, with 150,000 people around the world. And more recently, I left corporate life to become an executive coach and advisor, and I've written 4 books now, really all exploring this relationship between living systems, leadership, and how we go on a journey to reconnection. So that we can bring back the deep essence of life into our organizations. I've had the real pleasure of working with Laura Storm on this latest book, and we've had some great fun together, running workshops, researching, and writing the book together.
Great. What really kind of like brought you to the journey of regenerative leadership?
Well, I started writing about using the word regenerative back in about 2014. It wasn't that well known then, but for me, it represented something core to how nature operates, which is this concept of things following a certain flow, a certain pattern, that we find within all living systems, a kind of that death, decay, learning, development, introspection leads to new life, new horizons. The ebb of the winter leads to the spring of the next year. And I had been exploring organizations as living systems for some time, came across biomimicry in 2008, and really was interested in how we could take learning from the patterns and principles that we find in the deep wisdom that we find within living systems to organizations. So regenerative leadership really was bubbling up for me. I was writing about it in Future Fit. And then when Laura and I came together, it just felt the time was right to focus specifically on that in this book.
Right. So about regenerative leadership, we definitely like to go deeper on that later. But I believe it's all about like kind of reconnecting to life. And then to bridging that kind of sense of living to, like normal world, which is kind of operating in old paradigm, is not easy, I guess. So how do you trying to kind of bridge like new paradigm and then old paradigm?
Well, I think you've really gone to the heart of the challenge. What is all this about? It's about a shifting from a way of perceiving life that has become more and more mechanistic. Now, there's nothing actually wrong with the mechanistic way of attending if it forms a tool within how life really is. But when that way of attending becomes so prevalent in everything that we do, it can crowd out how life really is. And that's what's happened in society around the world now. I mean, it started really in the West, and the Eastern way actually had a more inherently attuned way of working with living systems. But now this prevalent way has become dominant over the world, and it's very mechanistic. And that creates problems. It creates the problems that we're facing in the world today, systemic challenges, from climate change to social inequality, from pollution to child labor. All of those are kind of downstream effects of a mechanistic way that focuses too much on the bits and bytes, the short term, the fragmented perspective, and doesn't see the interconnections of life. So how we shift that way of perceiving life is really at the heart of regenerative leadership. And you're right, the problem comes is that because we live in a society, a culture, a business mindset that is so caught up in it, even when we think we're trying to shift into applying living systems logic, we drift back into a mechanistic way. I'm doing some work at the moment with an organization that is really, really interested in learning from principles of nature, and yet the way they're doing it is still mechanistic. So for instance, circular economics is often, it's based on how nature works, cycles, flows, inputs, outputs. And yet we then say, okay, let's focus on circular economics, but from a mechanistic perspective. So the fact it's using cycles is kind of irrelevant, really. It's not really inspired by nature. It's not really attuned with the wisdom of nature if it's just using a mechanistic lens. So to get underneath that, one has to have a shift in consciousness, or a shift in how we perceive life. Because a shift in consciousness can feel really grand, but actually it can happen just like that in the moment. And the most powerful way I've found for enabling that to be embodied is by taking people out into nature, hence why that's a core part of my work. But what we've done in the book is we've looked at the three parts of the regenerative DNA logic: living systems design, living systems culture, living systems being. And we've infused within those three layers.
That's all right. Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So infused within the logic of life is methods that help us shift beyond the mechanistic paradigm. So within living systems design, we talk quite a lot about the ecosystemic facilitator, which is someone who is able to tune in to the whole system and be in service of the emergent and evolutionary dynamics that we find within what we're designing, the processes and the places that we're designing. And in living systems culture, we spend a lot of time talking about how we bring our own self-awareness and systemic awareness, and that we play with tensions like diversity and purpose to create cultures that really are alive, that are shifting from a mechanistic perspective, a top-down mechanistic perspective. And then underpinning both of those areas is living systems being. And living systems being is really embodying that way of perceiving, engaging with life, with reality, a quality of presence, which helps us become grounded in life, in nature.
Right, interesting. Actually, I remember you last time we talked. I remember like you talking about like kind of Like we always said, like we need to create like kind of living system organizations, but organization is always already alive there. And then it's us to see or treat or to sense, organization as a machine. And then that's why we really get into the, we need to get deeper into the, like our consciousness or like paradigm, how we look at the world, how we look at, this life, right? So would you go a little bit deeper on about your perspectives of the DNA consists of living system being? What the importance of the important essence of the living system being?
Well, underpinning that is so flowing throughout the regenerative DNA are two dynamics: leadership dynamics and life dynamics. And the leadership dynamics is a self-awareness of how we're showing up in the world, of our own blind spots, our own ego awareness, and our own personality, and our own emotional intelligence. And that leadership self-awareness attunes and opens up with systemic awareness, which is the capacity that we all have as human beings, naturally, to tune into the systems that we're operating in. Those systems might be the relationships of people around us, in our family, in our team, in our organization, and in our wider stakeholder ecosystem. So being able to sense into them, and the main shift there to develop that systemic awareness is to shift from the head into the heart or into the body. And that's quite difficult. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do in a society that is so in the head. And what living systems being does through the quality of presence, coherence, abundance, silence, patience, are the qualities that we talk about in the book, dancing with the rhythm of life. All of those qualities are helping us open up at a full-bodied level. So if we think of our body-mind, as the famous biologist Candice Pert talks about it, because our mind is actually not just in our brain, it's flowing throughout our whole psychosomatic network. And of course, it's also then interrelating with a greater mind, a field that we're in, because that information is disseminating and reverberating all around us. So when we attune our body-mind, which is what living system being does, it gives us a practice around opening up. And what we're doing is we're helping, and this touches to a lot of Eastern traditions, Shintoism, Taoism, Buddhism, all of these have practices innate within them that help us open up our body-mind. Tai Chi, Qigong, all of these are core to that. So what we're doing is we're opening up our neurological networks. The left and right brain hemisphere, we're allowing to interrelate more readily. The left brain hemisphere, we see the bits and bytes, and it takes things out of their lived-in context and gets us that mechanistic view, which is important for project managing, for engineering solutions. And yet we also need the right brain hemisphere, which sees the interrelations. And so by practices, we can allow the left and right brain hemispheres to interrelate. We can also then allow, with our heart awareness and practices around heart coherence that we explore in the book, allow these brain waves to start embedding themselves on the deeper waves of the heart. And then when that happens, our body, mind, goes into flow, where the neurological networks, the psychosomatic networks, and the nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic networks, all start to cohere. That's what we talk about as coherence and presence. We start to open up the body. And in so doing, all of our natural capacities that we have as human beings to sense into the system, to attune with nature, to sense into when things are right and not right, when things are at the right time to do something, or what the flows or the stuckness that are happening in the organization. We open up that capacity and we become what we call in the book ecosystemic facilitators. So all we're doing is opening up a natural human capacity that we have as leaders to enable us to become more systemic, more regenerative. So we can create the conditions for, as you say, allowing the living organization just to see it as it really is, because it is always alive. It's just that we're seeing it in a mechanistic perspective. So it just helps us open up our perceptual horizon.
Interesting. When I read this book, I really kind of feel it's not something like, oh, I get a new knowledge, but I feel like more rather than like I feel like I kind of remember the precious sense of living that I already have, or there's something already there in my body, or like in my life, right? So so like attuning with nature is not something you install from outside, but maybe like kind of like remember or like activate or like open up, like something there already there, right? And then I'd like to go kind of deeper on ecosystem facilitator, and it's a kind of, I believe it's kind of a core or essence of the or role of the regenerative leaders. So, and how do you kind of like support, or how do you advise for those who get aware of the kind of important sense to become a kind of like ecosystem facilitator?
So one of the things I like to do when I work with an organization is spend some time sensing into the organization, its own field of relationships, the people within it, its culture, you can get a sense of, and also its ecosystem. So the partners that it has, the relationships it has with suppliers, customers, wider society and the environment, and regulators and so forth. And through various meetings, conversations, and sensing in, you can develop that sense. Then really, the important thing for me as an external advisor is to then start identifying people in the organization who are going to be these natural ecosystemic facilitators, because some people are more naturally open to it, or are already, because of the work they've done in their own life or the life experiences they've had, are already more open to it. I truly believe that everybody has the natural capacity, but obviously we're all in different positions and different places and have different life experiences and different personalities. So there are some people who you can then identify and think, okay, because of either their informal network within the organization or their ability to be more receptive and open to what we're exploring, we can work with them. And then there is some coaching to work with that small group of people. And this could be just 5, 6, 10 people from different parts of the organization, regardless of hierarchy. It's good to have some senior people in there, but it's not good for them all to be at the same level. And then you can work with those ecosystemic facilitators and encourage them to, really my job is to give them the confidence, because I've been in business for many years and I've worked with CEOs and chairmen and boards of different businesses and different companies. I give them the confidence that what we're exploring is the important next stage to leadership. It's the important next stage to helping your organization become agile and future fit. It's not some woo-woo distraction or nice thing to do. It is the most important thing that's going to enable your organization to thrive going forward. So there's some important piece around that, giving people the confidence, encouraging them to do that. And sometimes taking that group out into nature, sitting around the fire, spending deep time with them out of their normal environment can really help. And once you then develop that group, they themselves, with some practice, can start then tuning in to their own parts of the system, of the organization, of the stakeholder ecosystem. And they then will start forming their own networks, and they will then probably identify their own next group of ecosystemic facilitators. You don't have to call them that. I mean, that's just an academic expression for the book, but whatever you want to call them, change champions or superconductors, whatever, it doesn't matter. But then one can start percolating that capacity, opening up that capacity. We were just enlivening the organization by identifying people who can then work with others and so forth. And it's creating what we call positive deviance. There's a whole book on positive deviance, where you create people who are able to then start acting as the imaginal cells, if you like, in the caterpillar's metamorphosis.
Right.
So they start transforming the organization from within, from the way they're behaving, the way they're interrelating, the way they're conducting meetings, the way they're asking questions, they're engaging in dialogue, creating generative spaces. All of that then starts cultivating the conditions for the organization to start coming alive.
Interesting. I have two things to ask. So again, actually, how do you define ecosystemic facilitator?
How do I define? Well, there's a glossary in the back of the book. I mean, I can look at it now if you want, but off the top of my head, really, it's the capacity to sense the stuckness, the flows, the acupuncture points, the boundaries, the senses of connection, the nodes, all of that in the organization. So it's the capacity. The most important thing is what you talked about early on, which is the capacity to start shifting into that living systems way of seeing the organization. That's the first step. The second step would then be someone who's built the confidence to be able to hold space for generative explorations, generative discussions, so that they can then facilitate others to start seeing the connections and start unlocking the stuckness. And that stuckness we usually unlock through conversations. I mean, this is the big thing. I mean, we talk about...
You mean dialogue?
Dialogue, yeah. Our organizations are just made up of messy human relationships, unpredictable chats, conversations, meeting conventions, so forth. The most inefficient thing that is happening in our organizations today is ineffective communication. And so, we talk about all these different leadership models and, how we need to digitize and so forth, but we missed the important point, which is that organizations are just made up of human beings. And the way in which we can unfold that flow between human beings to work across silos, to create regenerative ways of working, starts first and foremost with the human relationship. And so ecosystemic facilitators first need to understand and see things ecosystemically. Second, they then need to be able to be facilitators, hold space.
How do you define the difference between ecosystemic and systemic?
So right at the heart of this shift between mechanistic to living systems is three levels I've broken down. The first level is at the head level, so shifting from mechanistic, narrowing down, looking at the parts, to what Otto Scharmer calls open mind, which is systems thinking. So systems thinking has been around in business for some years now, so it's more well understood. And so that's the ability to map out the connections between people, between departments, between activities, between processes. And that systems thinking mapping, giga mapping, there's lots of tools that one can use to do that. And that's really useful. But that's at the head level. Then there's systemic awareness, second level, which is more at the embodied level, which is where we start empathically connecting with the system. That's where that living systems being comes in, where we are able to start opening up to the system through our shift in awareness. And that means that things like systemic coaching, constellation work, generative dialogue, anything that is helped stakeholder dialogue, anything that's starting to allow different parts of the system to connect better. Social presencing is a good tool, embodied tool, anything that's starting to sense into the system in a more intuitive and more imaginal feeling and somatic way rather than just a rational analytic way.
Right.
And then there is ecosystemic awareness. And ecosystemic awareness is the final piece, really, but it's the root that holds it all, which is where we deeply connect with life. So ecosystemic, we're not just, because there's a lot of people in the systemic coaching world, but it can still be anthropocentric. It can still be human beings. We are connecting as human relationships, but it hasn't gone beyond that. When we move into living systems way of attending, we have a deep sense of the interconnectedness of life, all living beings, Earth as a living system, which has lots of nested living systems all operating within it. It could be that, for instance, a watershed, a mountainside with the ecosystems in it, that is again as an ecosystem, right the way through to an organization, team, and its supply value chain. All of those are ecosystems of relationships. And really opening up to that beyond the human is where the ecosystemic comes in, where we have an innate sense, and I again would say that we all have this capacity, and many of us have probably had this experience when we've been out in nature, or we've had a beautiful moment in our lives, a peak experience, where we've sensed the oneness, the interconnectedness of how life is. Again, it's at the heart of all the ancient wisdom traditions, and it's at the heart of what Eastern wisdom is very much about embodying. And what we're doing is we're bringing that right in to the center of leadership. For our organizations to truly come alive, we need to have that innate sense of everything being interconnected, not just humanity, not just human systems, but everything. Then we realize that the organization is interrelating with people's families and friends, is interrelating with the society and the environment, is constantly having impacts and effects on plants, on all sorts of living beings on this planet. And the big change there is that we move out of climate change, for instance, of trying to deal with climate change through carbon reduction and so forth, to realizing that climate change is just a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, which is that we have divorced ourselves from life, and that the real opportunity for us now is to start reconnecting ourselves with life through regenerative leadership.
Yeah, I really resonate with it, and I think it's a kind of massive change. You know, it's a. And how do you think the shift from the second layer of like systemic to the third layer of ecosystemic happens? How do you think about that?
The most powerful way I've found to enable it to happen is by taking people into nature. And it's simple. It's simple but powerful, because a lot of the masks and protections that we have that reduce down our capacity to sense that interconnectedness, which are psychological, are because of the way in which humans interrelate with other humans, because we feel fearful, or the ego, or will that person judge me, whatever it is. And all of that really happens in the built environment, whether we're in the office or we've gone off to an away day at a nice corporate hotel. People still feel it. They've still got their different clothes on and so forth. When you get them out into nature and they just wear normal clothes, and we sit around the fire and we do basic things that human beings have done for millennia, and people can see the trees, they can feel the wind, they relax. Now, we have to do some practices. We consciously do practices on leadership emotions to help people then open up. So it's because, so people feel comfortable and able to open. And then within a couple of hours, through practices and through talking and generative discussion and space holding, then people are starting to open up and they can have deep experiences of the interconnectedness of life. So that's what my leadership emotions do. They focus on that. So people come away from the day, and it can be quite a short day from 9:30 to 4:30 because leaders are busy. But in that short period of time, they will walk away with embodied experience of the interconnectedness of life that will stay in them for the rest of their lives. They may not be able to directly use it in their next day, but it's there as a capacity that they can call upon, which is, so we're helping build the muscles, if you like, for us to start shifting into how we are truly meant to be as human beings.
Yeah, I really love that. And, you know, like in Japan, we have beautiful natures, and then actually, like people, a lot of people are kind of, you know, getting, you know, into the nature and then feel that kind of sense. But my question is, you know, what is always happening is, you know, people get into the nature, and then even if they really got deeper on that, when they're coming back to the society or like, you know, business field or, you know, in daily life, the paradigm of the society is still there, kind of like old paradigm is still there. And then how do you kind of like support or make a continuous practice or continuous behavior or being, not like kind of like temporal kind of, you know, relaxation? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is as a coach, where I work with leaders over periods of time, because to build the capacity to start developing a new practice, a new way of living, a new way of perceiving life takes time. So again, some of the programs we're running here is when people come and have immersions over a period of time. Anything, but you don't have to keep on coming to nature. You can do this yourself. There are certain practices that help us loosen the mechanistic perspective that we've got so caught up in and start opening up to the living systems approach. But really, it's part of a threshold crossing for the individual, a shift. It's not just about thinking differently. It's not just about having positive thoughts. It's not just about positive psychology. It's a shifting in our ego stage development. And that usually people have to be ready for. So people often, I mean, I don't really particularly market myself or my services. People come across me probably when the time is right for them, or they come across whatever work that they're doing, because lots of people, other people are doing this work as well. Important work of helping people shift to their next stage. I think what's an important part of what I do with regenerative leadership is bringing the nature capacity within it, the nature piece. So for instance, I'm coaching someone at the moment who's going through a big change in their life. And as part of the sessions that I'll be taking them through, we will go into the woods and have a kind of threshold crossing, a vision quest, if you like. Not a particularly long one, because vision quests can be 3 or 4, 5, 6, 10 days in nature on your own. But the people I work with are business leaders, busy, they don't have that time, or they don't feel they have that time anyway. So often I have to do things shorter, but in that time I can still do something quite deep, even if it's just an overnight in nature. But as you say, the importance is then, what do you learn from that? How can you then build that into your everyday life? And then this is where peer coaching is helpful, where you start buddying up with other people in the organization to share what are the challenges. How do you notice when you slip back? How do you notice when, you know, what's the shift? Because the organization is constantly going through this shifting back and forward, as we are as individuals, flickering, we call it in complexity theory. And when you have other people in the organization, other ecosystemic facilitators in the organization, they can help you. You can learn from each other. As well as just having a coach, you can have people in your organization that can help provide that support about where things are working better, where things need to be learned from. So it's a process of learning. It can take months and years.
Right. Yeah, actually, I believe like regenerative leadership is not like kind of like snapshot learning or like snapshot, you know, leadership things. Like, it's about like kind of learning journey all the way, and then the process itself is kind of like regenerative. And then actually, I'd like to move on kind of a little bit more about like organization topics, and then talking about the transformation. It's not I believe like transformation is not something, we forced to make it, or, rather it's kind of, it happens when it happens, or like when it's ready. Could you share a little bit more about like the condition of the transformation of the organization you mentioned just before?
Well, you're right in terms of the timing of things. The conditions kind of emerge and show themselves either at the individual level, the team level, or the organizational level. I think what I would say is that we can cultivate the conditions. So we can help, like a gardener, help create the right conditions. So it's just not about forcing the flower to come out at the wrong time of year, but it is about creating the right manure and rich soil so the flower is not just parched with no real soil. So it's that kind of a metaphor is useful. So what we're doing with the ecosystemic facilitators in the organization is just cultivating the cultural conditions. So and I would say at a greater scale, if we look at the macro scale of what's happening in the world today and what's happening in our business cultures across the board, is the conditions, the life conditions for these organizations is starting to become riper and riper for transformation. Regardless of how old the organization is, whether it's a startup or whether it's a 100-year-old company, or whether it's a small organization with 20 people or a multinational with 200,000 people. What's happening is the bigger macro life conditions, the global conditions, if you like, are creating the situation for an upstretch, for the organization to have to transform. The mechanistic system of old just will not be able to cope with the level of volatility and systemic challenges that we now face, and the disruptive innovations that are happening. So that is that's a global issue, if you like. Then there's the local life conditions to that particular organization that one needs to take into account. And some of those factors are, how is the organization owned? Is it shareholder owned? Is it publicly listed? Is it privately owned? How long has the CEO been there? What's the history of the founders? What's the sense of purpose? And by purpose, I don't mean a mission statement or a PowerPoint pack or even a values chart on the wall. I mean something that is truly lived. And how is that unfolding through the culture? So there's lots of ways that we can sense into the local life conditions of that organization, and also what's happening in its ecosystem. Have there been some takeovers? Have there been some changes in the supply chain? Have there been some disruptive innovations? What's the downturn, or what's the regulatory conditions? All of that contributes to what the organization is specifically feeling. So we've got these global conditions, everything's having to change, climate change, systemic challenges, all sorts of issues that are around the world that are challenging it. And then there's the more local conditions specific to that organization. And then you can go right into the kind of micro level and work with the particular people in that organization that you're connecting with. What's going on in their lives? Where are they at? What's going on? Are they ready for a personal transformation? Are they ready to open up and become an ecosystemic facilitator? Some will be, some won't be. So it's just having that sense of looking at the life conditions at different levels.
Interesting. What is actually regenerative organizations? What do you think is the difference between, like some coming up kind of, autonomous like network organization? How do you define regenerative organization?
Yeah. So what we've done with a lot of these movements that are popping up at the moment, because these global life conditions are changing, what's happening is we are innovating. And so you have things like teal, evolutionary, you have, which is lots of businesses, and all of those methods are actually rooted in creating living systems. Frederick Laloux's work, for instance, Reinventing Organizations, makes it very clear. It's about creating a living system. And certainly Teal, that level of consciousness in spiral dynamics, is very much about living systems. And yet what we've done, and what we always do, is because we're so caught up in the mechanistic perspective, we then try and break that down and look at particular bits. So he very powerfully talked about 3 aspects: evolutionary purpose, self-organizing, and the journey towards wholeness. And what people have focused in on is self-organizing management structures, because that's the kind of the bit that people feel they can kind of manage or set up new structures for. And in so doing, we actually create a mechanistic lens to, we're not necessarily creating a living organization just by having self-organizing systems. And sometimes we create a bit of a mess because we just start trying to take apart a hierarchy without creating the wider conditions for the organization to come alive. So that's not the fault of Teal evolutionary business. It's the fault of that it's just that we always, if we're not careful, we take things mechanistically. It's a bit like in the sustainability movement. We talk about regenerative, we talk about circular economics, we talk about new ways of working, and yet we focus in on the mechanistic again, because that's what we're used to doing. Before we know it, it's all about measuring carbon, waste, water, and so forth, which of course we need to do, but we miss the bigger picture. So I think what's important about the regenerative leadership DNA model that myself and Laura Storm have shared to the world is that it has that integration of the inner and the outer, of the masculine and the feminine, of the left brain and the right brain hemisphere, of that systemic and ecosystemic. And it's that makes the organization regenerative. So I know organizations that are great at circular economics, and yet their cultures are not healthy. So that is not regenerative, even though they might be thinking they're doing some regenerative stuff. And I know some organizations that have really quite advanced cultures, and that you could argue the cultures are quite developmental, that encourage people to become more of who they truly are, that have a coaching culture, and that are good at that journey towards wholeness aspect. And yet they have products and services that are polluting, that are not really helping society move forward to a more conscious way. And so again, that's not fully regenerative. To be fully regenerative, we have to be looking at both the outer services and relationships and the inner capacities.
Yeah, it's kind of all the balance and, reconnecting with kind of, inner sustainability and outer sustainability go back horse. And then do you have any kind of like good example of kind of regenerative organization or regenerative leaders?
Well, we talk about different aspects of it within the book. We give different examples of different aspects. So, for instance, we give an example of a company that's doing well in diversity and inclusion, another organization that's doing well in self-organizing systems. And so there's lots of different organizations that are excelling in different parts.
It's great if you give us kind of like favorite.
Sorry?
It's great if you give us kind of like favorite example.
Favorite examples. I don't have any particular favorites. There's a bank, there's a UK bank called Triodos, which I think is, it's not just a UK bank. They've set up as a UK bank, but it's actually a global bank. It came out of the Netherlands. Triodos, I would say it is very interesting in terms of the work it's doing on its cultural level, but also the way it's working with its products and services to its clients. It provides financial services, so it provides investment money, essentially, but that money is invested in projects that are enhancing society and the environment, 100%. And you can go on the website and you can actually see every investment they make and what impact it has on society and environment. So they do not invest anything that isn't related to society and environment. So that for me is transformative, certainly on the journey towards being regenerative, because it's part of the solution. Whereas a lot of organizations that are perhaps positioned as being really good at sustainability, still the vast proportion of their products and services are not really helping us move towards a more regenerative future. So for me, it has to be an organization that is 100% focused on the shift towards a more regenerative future. And there are other examples. There's a housing association in the northeast of England that does some really great work, and that also is self-organizing, has a developmental culture, and works really well with its people. There's all sorts of organizations around the world. I wouldn't like to particularly throw a spotlight on some favorites because, yeah, it's more about the quality of the people involved. And many of those good quality people are involved in businesses that aren't regenerative, and yet they're doing good work in those organizations. So again, we've got to be careful that we don't say, oh, well, you're good and you're bad. I work with an organization at the moment, a big corporation, which has some really good people trying to move in the right direction. And it's not regenerative, and yet it's still an organization worth attending to because it's on a journey. Just like I coach people who are going through a journey. And so all of these organizations are going through their own journeys. And sometimes we wish to have a spotlight on someone who's really good or an organization who's really good. But actually, I think they're all on their own messy journeys.
Great. So actually, we are getting to the time ends, but could you give us kind of your perspective again on what is regenerative leadership, or what is regenerative actually for you?
Regenerative really is about creating the conditions conducive for life to flourish. It's about working with the inherent grammar that we find within nature, the inherent wisdom that we find within life. And to do that, we just need to open ourselves up to life, to reality, which we can naturally do as human beings. But in this world, because we live in a mechanistic culture, that requires us to go through a process of change, of transformation. And doing that at the organizational level and the leadership level helps our organization come alive and our people thrive. And that is regenerative.
Great. Actually, you published the book in July last year, I guess. And then, after that, like many things is happening maybe around you. And then how do you sense the world now? And maybe maybe you see kind of future glimpse of the, kind of regenerative era of regeneration, maybe. So how do you sense the world, or like how do you how was the kind of reflection of the publishment of the book?
I think people are taking the book they seem to be very interested in it, which is great. I think its time is right. I think even a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, people were perhaps not, the system wasn't quite ready. Now, the conversations I'm having with business leaders in quite mainstream organizations is fundamentally different than what it was a year ago. Something is shifting, and it's great that the book can contribute to help that shift. But certainly the conversations I'm having are really changing, and business people are far more open to thinking outside the box and doing things fundamentally differently than they were even just 3 years ago.
Great. What kind of like shift do you see or do you sense now?
Well, partly people are interested in climate change. Partly people are interested in sense of purpose. People are interested in mental well-being and health. People are interested in an agile organization. People are interested in how do we create a strategy that actually, enhances society or is more sustainable. And what regenerative leadership does is it cuts across all of that. It underpins all of that, rather than treating them as individual separate bits. So I was with a big organization yesterday, and we were exploring how, there were issues around mental health, culture, agility, sustainability, business strategy. All of those can be underpinned with regenerative leadership. And at the moment, there are different people dealing with them. how can we bring those people together so we can start getting a more coherent perspective on the organization? So I think the conversations are changing, they're becoming more joined up. People are seeing that actually the way we need to move into the world requires a fundamental shift of our culture, not just our products and our services or how we design things, but actually how we show up in the world.
Great. Actually, this is the last question. You mentioned about the Eastern philosophy of Eastern wisdom, and actually in the book also you go deeper on Eastern wisdom, ancient wisdom, such as when you mentioned about like activating human nature, like you mentioned like fire, water, like wind, and it's kind of very strongly related with like Eastern ancient wisdom. So since I'm based in Japan, Asia, so related with this concept of regenerative leadership, how do you see the importance of the ancient wisdom or Eastern ancient wisdom or culture, like philosophy, from your perspective?
It's fundamental. I think it would be a great shame if we end up losing all of those ancient threads, because all of them contain a deep understanding of how life really works. We've kind of lost that over the last 300 or 400 years when we've become more mechanistic, more science orientated in terms, I don't mean science, I mean kind of reductive mechanistic approach where we honor only the bits and bytes. So bringing back that ancient wisdom into today is what this is all about. It's what regenerative leadership is all about. So actually cultures that already have that closer to their surface, I believe will be able to start embracing this work quite quickly. I mean, Japan, for instance, even the total quality management approaches that they had a couple of decades ago were ahead of what was going on in the West because of their understanding of relationships, of working across boundaries. And this next stage, regenerative leadership, is going to bring in some of the ancient wisdom about how we work with nature and how we work with consciousness. And I could see some very interesting developments happening in the eastern part of the world around regenerative leadership.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to inviting you to a beautiful country and then go deeper on that, maybe. Yeah. So Giles, thank you so much. It was a fantastic time to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the conversation.
So bye.
Goodbye.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.